Welcome to Experiments in Happiness with Michelle Lemus, the podcast for high-achieving women who've checked all the boxes but still feel something's missing.
I think one of the most confusing parts of personal growth is realizing that sometimes growth doesn't feel exciting. It doesn't feel empowering. It doesn't even always feel positive. Sometimes it feels like loss. And I don't think people talk about that enough. Because when we talk about growth, we usually talk about the shiny parts, becoming more confident, setting boundaries, healing, choosing yourself, feeling more aligned. And those things are real. But what almost nobody talks about is the emotional weight of outgrowing your old life or your old identity or the version of yourself that used to feel normal. Because there's a strange kind of grief that can happen during growth, even when nothing is technically wrong. And honestly, I think that's what makes it so confusing. Because there's no obvious loss you can point to. Nobody died. Nothing dramatic necessarily happened. Your life might even look objectively better in some ways. And yet internally, something feels heavy, off, unsettled. And I think a lot of women immediately judge themselves for that feeling. Like, why can't I just be happy about this? Why does growth feel uncomfortable? Why do I suddenly feel disconnected? Why does this feel lonely? And honestly, I think part of the answer is because growth requires letting go, not just gaining, letting go. And letting go almost always comes with emotion, even when what you're letting go of no longer fits you. I noticed this in my own life when I started changing certain patterns. At first, I expected growth to feel mostly freeing, like once I became more self aware, more aligned, more intentional. Everything would just naturally feel better. But what surprised me was how many moments of growth actually felt disorienting first. Because the old version of me, the old ways of operating, had been familiar for a very long time. And familiar has emotional weight, even when it no longer feels healthy, even when it no longer feels aligned. And I think that's important because a lot of women think if I'm growing in the right direction, I shouldn't miss the old version of things. But honestly, you can miss something and still know it's time to move beyond it. Those things can exist together. You can feel aligned with where you're going and still grieve what you're leaving behind. I think this happens a lot when women start changing the roles they've always played. Maybe you've always been the accommodating one, the easygoing one, the helper, the overachiever, the fixer, the emotionally available one. And then slowly, those roles start feeling heavy. You start noticing how much energy they cost you. You start realizing, I don't actually want to keep operating this way anymore. And at first, that awareness can feel empowering. But then reality starts catching up because now the old version of your life doesn't fit the same way anymore. Conversations that used to feel normal suddenly feel draining. Dynamics you tolerated before start feeling uncomfortable. Certain environments stop feeling aligned. And honestly, that can feel really lonely sometimes, especially because from the outside, nothing may look dramatically different, but internally, everything feels different. I think this is one of the hardest parts of evolving emotionally. Your internal world changes before your external life fully catches up. And that creates tension because now you're existing between versions of yourself, not fully who you used to be, but not fully settled into who you're becoming yet either. And honestly, I think that middle space is emotionally exhausting sometimes because human beings naturally crave certainty, familiarity, identity stability. We want to know who we are, how we operate, where we belong, and growth temporarily disrupts all of that. Suddenly, the things that once felt automatic don't feel automatic anymore. The way you used to respond doesn't feel right. The way you used to tolerate things doesn't feel right. The way you used to shrink yourself doesn't feel right. And while that's growth, it can also feel like emotional homesickness, like missing a version of life that once felt easier. And I think that's why some women try to force themselves backward during growth. Not because they truly want to go back, but because they miss the familiarity. They miss the predictability. They miss knowing exactly how to exist inside their life because growth creates uncertainty, and uncertainty feels vulnerable. I think this is especially true when growth changes relationships because sometimes when you grow, your relationships don't immediately grow with you. And that can create this strange feeling of emotional disconnection. You start noticing conversations that revolve around patterns you no longer connect to. You start noticing how much you overextended yourself before. You start noticing dynamics that only worked when you ignored your own needs. And honestly, that awareness can feel sad, not because the people are bad, not because you're better than anyone, but because something that once fit doesn't fit the same way anymore. And I think many women feel guilty for that. Like, why am I pulling away? Why does this feel different now? Why can't I just enjoy this the way I used to? But honestly, sometimes growth changes your emotional capacity for certain things, not because you're cold, not because you're selfish, but because you're becoming more honest with yourself. And honesty changes things. I think this also happens internally too. Sometimes you grieve old versions of yourself, even versions that exhausted you. And I know that sounds strange, but I think it's real. Maybe you miss being carefree. Maybe you miss when things felt simpler. Maybe you miss who you were before certain realizations changed you, before burnout, before heartbreak, before self awareness, before growth forced you to reevaluate things. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with feeling sadness about that. I think women often pressure themselves to only feel the positive side of growth. Like if you're evolving, you should only feel grateful and empowered and excited. But human emotions don't work that cleanly. You can feel proud and sad, relieved and grieving, aligned and uncomfortable. Those things can coexist. And honestly, I think allowing both to exist is emotionally healthier than forcing yourself into fake positivity. Because fake positivity creates emotional resistance. You start fighting your own experience. Trying to convince yourself, this shouldn't feel hard. I should only feel grateful. But honestly, transitions are emotional, even healthy ones, even chosen ones, because transitions involve endings, and endings affect us emotionally. I think this is why so many women feel off during growth, but can't explain why. Because it's not obvious grief. It's subtle grief, identity grief, lifestyle grief, relationship grief, familiarity grief. And when you don't recognize it for what it is, you start pathologizing yourself. You think, maybe I'm ungrateful. Maybe I'm depressed. Maybe something's wrong with me. But honestly, sometimes nothing is wrong. Sometimes you're simply in transition. And transition is emotionally messy. I think one of the most healing things women can do during growth is stop demanding that every part of the process feel good. Because honestly, growth is not always comfortable. Sometimes growth feels destabilizing before it feels freeing. Sometimes growth feels lonely before it feels aligned. Sometimes growth feels heavy before it feels expansive. That doesn't mean you're moving in the wrong direction. It means you're human. And honestly, I think there's something really powerful about acknowledging what you're letting go of. Not dramatically, not in a way that keeps you stuck in the past, but honestly, this mattered to me. This version of my life mattered. This role mattered. This identity protected me for a long time. That acknowledgement matters emotionally because when we refuse to acknowledge endings, we often stay emotionally tangled in them longer. I think many women try to skip grief entirely. They want to jump straight into the empowered next chapter, but grief ignored tends to linger quietly underneath everything. And honestly, sometimes the most healing thing you can do is simply tell yourself the truth. I am changing. And part of me is sad about what I'm leaving behind. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you emotionally honest. I also think this is why growth can feel quieter than people expect. There's less certainty, less performance, more reflection, more noticing, more internal shifts happening before external clarity fully arrives. And honestly, That quiet season can feel really uncomfortable for women who are used to momentum, used to certainty, used to clear direction, because growth often asks you to sit in the unknown for a while, to trust yourself before you fully understand who you're becoming. That's hard, but I also think it's necessary because identity evolution takes time. You cannot rush yourself into becoming. You have to live your way into it slowly through choices, through awareness, through repetition, through honesty. And honestly, I think one of the kindest things women can do for themselves during this phase is stop interpreting emotional heaviness as failure. Sometimes heaviness simply means something important is shifting, something old is ending, something new is forming. That's not failure, that's transition. And maybe that's the experiment this week. Instead of immediately trying to fix that heavy, unsettled feeling, pause and ask yourself, what am I outgrowing right now? And then, what am I having to let go of because of that? Maybe it's a role. Maybe it's a pattern. Maybe it's a version of yourself that once felt safe. Whatever it is, just let yourself acknowledge it because acknowledgement creates movement. Acknowledgement creates clarity. And honestly, sometimes the reason growth feels so heavy is because you're trying to carry the future without grieving the past at the same time. And you're allowed to do both.
Thanks for listening to Experiments in Happiness. You can find more tools and resources at experimentsinhappiness.com.